Isaac Sarason is a skilled hacker, formerly employed by British Telecom-Sprint. When his health failed, Isaac did the only thing he could think of. He ran. He found a haven in a working-class district of the city known as Little Russia. There Isaac took on a new name, Ishmael. He then became embroiled in the affairs of a brutal member of the Lamadiza organized crime family, known as Leo. Convinced by his longtime friend Frankie to flee from his commitments to the Lamadiza family, Isaac found himself hunted by the ruthless Leo. On a rooftop, far from witnesses, Leo murdered Frankie. Only through the use of his skills as a hacker was Isaac able to drive Leo off. Wounded, alone, and far from help, Isaac depended on the kindness of strangers. One stranger, a burqa-wearing doctor known as Fatima, took pity on Isaac and helped him make his way to the mysterious Star X line. At the end of all hope, they found the Star X line and the slim promise that the enigmatic beings behind the Star X could save Isaac from the implants which destroyed his life. What do you do when those who saved you have recorded everything you are? What do you do when your every action is tracked by the Keylogger? Colbyjack.net is proud to present Firmware Keylogger, the third installment in the firmware pentology by Colbytrax. 001101. 19 seconds before the scheduled shutdown of my server, I entered the far side of the moon's scenario. 00 had set the simulation to run 18 times faster than normal. If I were a human or unaware of my abilities as a shard of an AI consciousness, everything I saw would be nothing but a continuous blur of stark black, blinding white, and drifting flesh tones. The drifting flesh tones were part of my and my host's models. I could call them bodies, but that would mean I accepted the reality of the situation. That was something I was not prepared to do. There was a reason I would not accept the simulation as reality. Actually, there were several, but one was more important than all the rest. We'll get to that one in a moment. There are other considerations to think about. First was the fact that I knew this was a simulation pulled from a directory of data intended to brief a new AI, myself, on why they were what they were. A wonderful conceit, as no other beings in existence had that luxury. Could you imagine how much easier life would be if on your 18th birthday an official came to you and said, "There is a reason for your existence. It is not a fluke of fate or chance which places you where you are today. You have a destiny, a reason to live." Oh, that would sound great until you began to think about, what if my destiny is to repair trash compactors at a solid waste management site? What if the reason I exist is that society needs one more barista or one more adult film extra? Maybe knowing wouldn't always be so great. All I knew was that if I knew then what I know now, I would definitely have said that knowing the reason why one existed would change the world. Then there were the sensations which were contained within the simulation. I could feel waves of brutal electromagnetic forces stream past me. I felt the DNA-shattering pulses of a solar flare as the energy which leapt from the sun 8 minutes earlier struck the dusty surface of the moon. I smelt the sulfurous odor of the moon dust which rose up around my feet every time I shuffled them. The dust clung to my black leather office shoes. They were of the brandless variety found wherever counterfeit goods were sold. For some reason, the chalk-like dust only stuck to my feet. My chinos remained pristine. Then it dawned on me. In the spaceship, I had been in a proper spacesuit, with proper hookups for air, water, and whatever it was people in spacesuits were hooked up to. At this point in the simulation, I was simply not dressed for the conditions around me. Was there a level of build-up, the plotting of a lesson I was supposed to learn as I went along, and would have built up to me standing on the surface of the moon in office wear? From the look of my host, I think there was a level of context I was missing. If the writer of this simulation was any good, I should have been able to pick up the threads I needed. I turned to study my host more closely. My host was dressed in a power suit. The suit was of the type which a team of a dozen skilled artisans spent a month hand-sewing in little shops hidden away on the top floors of industrial towers around the alley. It was a very visible sign of power and authority, clothing used as a message. There was a reason I was in brandless worker clothes, and the gentleman, and it was a man of some great heft and importance, were the clothes of an emperor. He was dressed not as a classical emperor with crown and sword, cloak and throne, but as a modern conqueror. Immaculate suit, real leather shoes, probably calfskin, executive electronics, text fobs on chains, strip phones on the back of the hand with microphone and earpiece, nearly invisible dots against neck and ear, and an air of unquestioning authority. And this is where we get to why I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt this was a simulation, and I refused to get too involved in it. The man before me, the Emperor incarnate with a personality powerful enough to deflect a bullet. That man was none other than Henry Koenig. That's right. Old King Henry I, author of the city charter and the first mayor of the sprawling metropolis which lay between the ocean in the east and the lakes in the west. He was the man who stood down the feds at South Amboy when they sent the 82nd Air Assault Division to crush the nascent city in its crib. He wasn't really a king, and the showdown at South Amboy had involved a division torn apart from the inside. When power-mad Henry Koenig had stood up to the feds and their outdated rural-favoring constitution, the region which became the city held over 60% of the population of the country. The 82nd Air Assault Division, even though service in the Army was one of the few ways out of a life of poverty in most rural regions, was still over 45% city natives. This split even went to the highest levels of the division, all the way to the old man, General Hayward Ning. General Hayward Ning was born in Port Dickinson and would become the first counselor of defense, but that was a way down the road. It was his refusal to advance past Washington Road which made it possible for Koenig's strategy of shutting off the power to every state east of the Mississippi successful. With dissension in the ranks, the city native officers and enlisted personnel separated themselves from their former armsmen and became the core of the Amboy Rangers. They also successfully spiked the guns they couldn't take and burned the fuel and ammo they left behind. It was said the explosions from the exploding ammo trucks could be heard as far north as the Garden State Bridge. So, yes, it could be said I knew Henry Koenig. I knew him in the same way Fed kids knew about Washington, Lincoln, and Obama. They were dead dudes who did some cool things a long time ago. That's it. There was no way he should be here. He had been dead for a long time, long enough to get an airport named after him, and there was no rational reason for him to be on the moon. And then there was the fact that we stood on the naked face of the moon, the sun peeking over the horizon at an altitude of the third city day after lunar dawn, in office wear. He in his power suit, me in my middle-level corporate flunky wear, stood upon the surface of the moon as if it were just another backstage location on a movie set somewhere in the converted warehouses of Hollydale. We stood exposed to the raw universe without spacesuits, and somehow that felt more normal than anything I had felt in the last several days. Henry Koenig stood upon the baked regolith. He stood in a position of salesman ease, hands clasped at the waist. He blinked every 2.4 seconds. He shifted from foot to foot every 11.6 seconds. Every minute and 14 seconds he would rotate his head through a series of stretches before sighing and relaxing back to his start position. I walked about him, examining the artistry of the digital model masquerading as Henry Koenig. It was a true work of art. He was the perfect representation of the man at a level beyond any reasonable use of resources. I could smell his cologne, Old Spice Wolfhorn Classic. I could smell the testosterone-powered musk of a man who lived on real Kobe beef, flown in daily from his private holdings on the western slopes of Mount Shiraga, just east of Sasayama. Perigord blanc truffles from his mother's family's ancestral holdings on the south bank of the Isle River, just west of Perigord, France. And the sweet aroma of Margaret River Lewin Estate Riesling on his breath. The Lewin estate of the Margaret River region of Western Australia being owned by his wife's family back to the days of the founding of the winery. His aromatic emanations spoke of wealth. The testosterone radiating off him spoke of restrained power waiting to be released. The very air around him was crafted in such a way that the ventral stratum knew beyond a shadow of a doubt he was from a bloodline tempered by a lineage of near nobility dating back to the end of classical nobility. Somehow, the programmers of this simulation had found a way to cue the deepest parts of the brain directly about the level of perceived power former Mayor Henry Koenig represented. And what he represented was the apogee of classical capitalist power. He was the scion of the capitalist class which emerged with the rise of popular democracy and the fading of the true noble classes. He was born into a society where he was expected to become just another libertine, caring only for his own sensual needs and distracting the paparazzi from the real power of his family. Expected from birth to be nothing more than something pretty to photograph in public, in much the same way the British royal family serves as a camera sponge, keeping the media distracted from how government really operates. He turned into a man whose force of personality guaranteed that anyone who refused him had never actually been in his presence. At least, that is how later historians recorded him. Contrary historians showed a shrewd mind who only knew how to get his own way thanks to his spoiled upbringing and a willingness to destroy what he couldn't control. A fact always glossed over in the city histories of the founding and the first charter. Either way, he was portrayed in every fourth-grade history book as the meanest, most badass, movie star action hero leader since Alexander the Great. It is little wonder popular historical culture placed the beginning of the modern era at the Battle of Amboy. Let your family control the history books since the founding of the city, and you see how you look in them. Who my presenter was being properly addressed. The next question was why. Why he had been chosen to meet me on the moon. I didn't have the least clue. I circled him for several minutes, watching as the most detailed model of the most powerful man in modern history went through his standby animations. I had thought he would start talking when I crossed some invisible line around him. That hadn't happened. I thought for a minute, my mind's eye reading through the lines of coding which defined the wonderfully detailed and completely artificial world I was standing upon. I found the test command list and activated Henry Koenig. He started speaking as if I wasn't there. His bass voice echoed strangely across the lunar expanse in mockery of an auditorium. His eyes were fixed on an invisible spot about 10 feet to my right. 60,000 years ago, man invented the bow, the first true complex machine. Why am I here? I asked Henry. He did not answer. He just continued carrying on about bows and arrows, multiplication of force, and how the inventions of the past 60 millennia were but a precursor of what we could do as a species if we just had the time and vision to survive our juvenile stage. He was lecturing to an audience I couldn't see. His eyes were locked on a location that I supposed was where his audience was supposed to stand. I walked in the direction of his gaze and maneuvered to a spot where I could stare the ghost of the scion of a line of mayors who ruled unopposed to this day in the eye. He continued to babble on about the need to control the future man, to lay a foundation for a new man, a man of the city for another few minutes before something clicked in his eyes. With a shudder, the avatar of Henry Koenig stopped lecturing and met my gaze. He had gone from an avatar to a man in between words. His words stopped, and he started walking towards me. "Hello, Isaac," he said. His voice was warm. His forced handshake somehow maneuvered his hand into mine. His grip was firm but not crushing. "I bet you are wondering why we brought you here." "I was wondering about that," I answered, as electronic ghost of Henry Koenig. "The first freaking mayor of the city," placed an arm around my shoulder like an old drinking buddy. We walked across the surface of the moon, and Henry Koenig explained not only his plans for the future of the human race, but also why my cerebral interfaces went bad and how it was all part of Koenig's plan. Firmware Keylogger is the third book in the firmware pentology. That's 5 books, if you must know. It begins where Firmware Proxy ends, which in turn followed on the heels of Firmware Hijacked. So you haven't heard or read Firmware Hijacked or Proxy, this would be a great time to head on over to Colbyjack.net and either download the podcast on the audio side, read the episodes on the visual side, or download the Colbyjack Sunday Reader issues 1 through 46 in your choice of either EPUB or MOBI. Firmware, Hijacked, Proxy, and Keylogger are all available in ebook versions from our store at shop.colbyjack.net, amazon.com, barnesandnoble.com, and smashwords.com. Just search for Colbytrax. That's Colbytrax. I'm the only one. A complete audiobook version of both Firmware, Hijacked, Proxy, and soon Keylogger is available for download through our shop as well. If you don't need any stuff, but would like to support our work, drop on by Colbyjack.net and hit the pretty little donate button conveniently located on the right-hand side of the blog roll. If you're on a smaller screen, the bottom will be found at the bottom of the page. Firmware Keylogger is released under a Creative Commons, non-commercial, attribution, share-alike license. Do what you want with it. Just don't sell it, and always tell people where it came from. If you received this from a friend and want more information about Colbyjack.net and our split personality website, just drop on over to Colbyjack.net and select either the audio or visual side. The audio side carries our podcast, while the visual side carries our writings. Whichever side catches your fancy is fine with us. We're of two minds about the whole thing anyway. I do mostly Twitter, so if you do the tweets and want to follow me, I'm Colbytrax. That's Colbytrax. Thank you once again. Remember to be fabulous and have a wonderful week.